The Atlantic was not a sea in 1587, it was a hungry god. For the 115 souls aboard the Lion and its smaller consort, the world had shrunk to the width of a salt-crusted deck and the height of a snapping sail. They were not conquistadors seeking gold, nor were they monks seeking converts. They were the desperate. Tailors from London's back alleys, pregnant women clutching pewter spoons, and children who had forgotten the smell of dry earth. Governor John White looked at the horizon. He was an artist by trade, a man of charcoal and vision, but now he was a shepherd of the damned. His daughter, Eleanor Dare, stood beside him, her hand resting on the heavy swell of her stomach. Inside her was the future of an empire, or perhaps the first sacrifice to a land that did not want them. Chapter 1: The Pilot's Treachery. The original plan was simple. Fetch the 15 soldiers left at Roanoke by the previous expedition, then sail north to the Chesapeake Bay to establish the city of Raleigh. The Chesapeake had deep harbors and fertile soil. Roanoke was a sand trap. But Simon Fernandez, the Portuguese pilot, had other plans. As the ships approached the shallow inlets of the Outer Banks on July 22, 1587, his patience snapped. "Out, all of you!" Fernandez roared, his voice cutting through the humid Carolina air. "We are not at our destination, Simon," White protested, gesturing to the charts. "The Chesapeake is leagues to the north." "The summer is fading, and my sailors have no stomach for your English dreams," Fernandez sneered. "I drop you at Roanoke, or I drop you in the surf. Make your choice, Governor." Under the threat of being abandoned at sea, the 115 began the slow, agonizing process of disembarking. As the small boats touched the shore, the colonists expected to see the 15 soldiers left behind a year prior. Instead, they found silence. The fort was a skeletal ruin. The houses were choked with wild melon vines, and in the center of the clearing lay a single human skeleton, the bones picked clean by wolves and bleached white by the relentless sun. The soldiers were gone. The protection was gone. The nightmare had begun. Chapter 2: The Birth of Virginia and the Harvest of Blood. The first month was a fever dream of labor. They repaired the cottages and cleared the brush. On August 18th, the silence of the wilderness was broken by a high, thin wail. Eleanor Dare had given birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia, for she was the first English child born in this wild, vast territory. But as the child drank her first milk, the woods began to speak. George Hoe, a gentleman and a father, wandered away from the settlement to catch crabs in the shallows. He never returned. 2 days later, his body was found in the reeds. He had been shot 16 times with arrows tipped in sharpened bone. His head had been smashed with a stone mace. The message from the Socotan tribe was clear. The previous English soldiers had been cruel, and the price for their sins would be paid by the new families. Fear, thick and cold as the morning fog, settled over the colony. Chapter 3: The Departure of the Governor. By late August, the realization hit like a physical blow. They had no food. The supplies brought from England were rotting in the humidity. The deer were elusive, and the colonists did not know which berries were life and which were death. "You must go back, Father," Eleanor said, holding the infant Virginia. "I cannot leave you here," he replied, his voice breaking. "If I leave, I may never find my way back through the Spanish blockades." "If you stay, we all die," she countered. On August 27, 1587, John White boarded the ship to return to England. He left behind his daughter, his granddaughter, and 113 others. He promised to return by Easter. He did not know that King Philip II of Spain was preparing the Great Armada, and that every English ship would be seized for war. The 115 were now truly alone, on the edge of the world. Chapter 4: The Winter of Hunger. September brought the great storms. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and the wind tore the thatch from the roofs. Without White's leadership, the colony fractured. Captain Stafford, a man of iron and little empathy, took charge of the armory. "We must raid the mainland villages," he argued in the flickering light of the communal fire. "And start a war we cannot win?" Eleanor Dare stepped forward. Virginia's father stepped forward. "Monteo says the tribes are many, and we are few. We must negotiate." Monteo was their only hope. A Croatoan native who had been to London looked at these pale strangers with a mix of pity and frustration. He taught them how to make weirs to catch fish, but the fish were small. He taught them how to find tuckahoe roots, but the roots were bitter and required hours of pounding. By December, the first of the colonists died, not from an arrow, but from the bloody flux. Then came the cold. The Carolina coast, usually mild, was hit by an Arctic blast. The wood was too wet to burn hot. The colonists huddled together, skin hanging loose on their bones, watching the tree line for the flash of an arrow or the shadow of a Spanish sail. While the English starved, the Spanish Empire was hunting them. In St. Augustine, the Spanish governor had sent Captain Vicente Gonzalez to find the English pirate nest. In the spring of 1588, Gonzalez's ship drifted past the Outer Banks. He saw the smoke. He saw the small, pathetic English flag fluttering in the wind. "They are weak, Captain," his lieutenant remarked. "We could land now and end them." "No," Gonzalez replied, crossing himself. "The English are like rats. If you corner them, they bite. Let the winter and the savages do the work. We will return in a year to collect the iron and the gold." The Spanish did not know that the pirates they hunted were actually women like Margaret Lawrence, who was currently trading her wedding ring to a local scout for a handful of parched corn. Chapter 6: The Turning Point. By May 1588, Easter had passed. No ships appeared on the horizon. The colonists spent their days staring at the sea until their eyes ached. "My father is not coming," she said to Anaïs. She was no longer the soft woman from London. Her face was lined, her hands calloused. Little Virginia was crawling now, her skin tanned dark by the sun. "Monteo says his people on Croatoan Island have enough to share, but only if we come to them as brothers, not as masters," he whispered. This was the forbidden path. To leave the fort was to admit defeat. To join the tribes was to lose their Englishness and, in the eyes of the church, their souls. "Stafford will never allow it," Anaïs warned. "Stafford is one man," Eleanor replied, looking at the 20 remaining children in the camp. "I will not let my daughter starve for the sake of a flag." The conspiracy began in the dark. The families began to secret away tools, nails, and Bibles. They were preparing to disappear.
As the summer of 1588 approached, the heat became a physical weight, thick with the scent of pine resin and rotting marsh gas. The English supplies were now a memory. The last barrel of salted pork had been opened weeks ago, revealing only brine and maggots. Eleanor Dare watched from the palisade as the men grew hollow-eyed. Captain Stafford had instituted the rule of the iron ration. Anyone caught stealing from the communal grain bin would face the wooden stocks or the lash. The irony was bitter. There was almost nothing left to steal. Monteo, who had become the colony's unofficial lifeline, brought a small group of Croatoan hunters to the gates. They carried baskets of maize and dried oysters. But this was not charity. It was a test. The Croatoan elders wanted to see if the clothed people could adapt. "Your God is silent here," Monteo told Eleanor one evening as they sat near the embers of a dying fire. "My people hear the wind. We hear the spirits of the deer. If you want to live, you must stop looking at the sea. The sea brought you here to die. The land is what will keep you alive." While Eleanor and the families looked toward Monteo, Captain Stafford and his soldiers looked toward their muskets. Stafford was a man born of the old world's hierarchies. To him, the indigenous people were not neighbors, they were subjects who refused to bow. "We are being led by a woman and a savage," Stafford bellowed in the town square. "John White left me in charge of the defense. We will not trade our English pride for roots and berries. Tomorrow we march to the mainland. The Socotan have granaries. We have steel." Eleanor Dare stood in his way. "If you attack them, Stafford, you sign all our death warrants. There are thousands of them in the deep woods. We are barely 100. The confrontation was the first crack in the colony's soul. Stafford's men, driven by hunger and a desperate need for action, seized the remaining powder and shot. That night, they rowed across the Sound in silence. Their goal, the village of Dasamonk Peak. The attack was a tragedy of errors. In the pre-dawn mist, the soldiers saw the glow of a campfire and the shadows of figures moving near the water. Believing they had found the Socotan warriors who killed George Ho, Stafford gave the order to fire. A volley of musket fire shattered the morning silence. Cries of agony erupted from the camp. But as the smoke cleared and the soldiers rushed in with their swords, the horror realized itself. The people they had shot were not the Socotan. They were a peaceful party of Croatoan, Monteo's own people, who had come to the mainland to gather tobacco for the English as a gift. Monteo's mother's cousin lay gasping in the dirt, his chest torn open by English lead. The betrayal was absolute. The bridge between the two worlds hadn't just cracked, it had been incinerated. When Stafford returned to the fort with his blood-stained men, Monteo's face turned to stone. He did not yell, he did not weep. He simply walked to the gate. "I brought you my heart, and your men fed it to the dogs. The Croatoan will no longer protect you. The Socotan are coming. The sky will rain fire, and I will not be here to catch the arrows." With Monteo's departure, the lost colony became a tomb. For 3 nights, the woods were filled with rhythmic drumming. The Socotan were calling their allies. The English spent their nights in the center of the fort, muskets trembling in their hands, watching the tree line for the first sign of the orange glow of flaming arrows. In the chaos, Eleanor Dare stepped into the void of leadership. While Stafford drank the last of the medicinal brandy and the other men argued, she gathered the women and the laborers. "We have 2 choices," she whispered, her voice like a knife. "We stay here and wait for the Socotan to burn us alive, or we disappear, not as a colony, not as a settlement, but as a ghost." She showed them the plan. They would not flee blindly. They would dismantle the houses. If there was no fort, there was no target. They would bury the heavy things, the armor, the stone cannons, the chests of books. They would carry only what they needed to survive: seeds, knives, and the Bible. "And where do we go?" Margaret Lawrence asked, clutching her thin child. "South," Eleanor said, "to the island of my father's friends. Even if they hate us now for Stafford's sins, they are our only hope. We will beg for their mercy. We will become their servants if we must, but Virginia will live." The dismantling began in July 1588, exactly 1 year after their arrival. It was a feat of desperate engineering. They worked only at night to avoid being seen by scouts. The heavy oak beams were pulled down. The palisade was thinned. One night, as Eleanor was packing her father's sketches, the only things she had left of him, Stafford entered her cabin. "This is treason, Eleanor," he hissed, "abandoning the Queen's land." "The Queen is 3,000 miles away, Captain," she replied without looking up. "The Socotan are 300 yards away. You have your guns. I have my daughter. Go play soldier in the woods if you wish, but the rest of us are leaving." Stafford, broken by his own failure, did not stop them.
He stayed in the ruins of the fort with 10 of his most loyal men, swearing to hold the land for the crown. The rest, the families, the 90 souls who wanted to live, followed Eleanor and Ananias into the dark water of the Sound. Before she stepped into the boat, Eleanor stopped at the main entrance. The heavy post of the palisade stood tall against the moonlight. "Carve it," she told Ananias. "What? The cross?" "No, just the name of the place. If my father ever returns, he must know where we went, but he must also know we went there by choice, not by force." With a mallet and chisel, Ananias labored for an hour. Croatoan. The letters were deep and jagged. It was a tombstone for their English lives and a map for their uncertain future. The voyage into the unknown was a descent into purgatory. They moved in small skiffs, rowing through the shallow, treacherous waters of the Pamlico Sound. Every ripple in the water felt like a Spanish hull. Every rustle in the marsh grass felt like a Sicotan scout. By the second day, the sun was a blinding torment. 2 of the elders died of heat stroke. Their bodies slipped quietly into the brackish water. Virginia, the child of the New World, did not cry. She watched the birds, her gray eyes reflecting the vast, uncaring sky. When they finally saw the shores of the southern island, they didn't see a rescue party. They saw a line of warriors standing on the dunes, their bodies painted with red ochre and black charcoal. Montejo stood in the center. The English dropped their oars. They stood up in their boats, ragged, hungry, and unarmed. Eleanor held Virginia high in the air, a white flag of living flesh. The silence lasted for an eternity. Then Montejo stepped into the surf. "You cannot be English here," Montejo's voice carried over the waves. "If you step on this sand, you are Croatoan. Your names will die. Your language will become a whisper. You will work until your backs break. You will marry into our blood, and you will never, ever look for the ships again." Eleanor looked at Montejo. She looked at the families behind her. She thought of the gold-leafed courts of London, the smell of damp wool, and the sound of church bells. It was a world that had forgotten them. She stepped out of the boat and into the waist-deep water. She waded toward Montejo, the water soaking her heavy English skirts, pulling at her, trying to drag her back. She didn't stop until she stood face to face with the man they had betrayed. "I am not Eleanor of London," she said, her voice clear. "I am the mother of this child. Tell us what to do." And with those words, the colony was no longer lost. It was transformed.
Before the skyscrapers touched the clouds, and before the highways scarred the earth, there was a silence in the American West so profound it could drive a man mad. But in 1865, that silence was broken by the thunder of 10,000 hooves and a secret that the U.S. government tried to bury for a century. This is not the Hollywood version of the Wild West. This is the blood, the iron, and the impossible truth of the siege of Platte Bridge. The wind across the Dakota Territory didn't just blow, it screamed. For young Lieutenant Casper Collins, a mapmaker's son from Ohio, the West was not a land of gold, it was a land of ghosts. He stood atop the rickety wooden watchtower of a lonely outpost, staring into an endless sea of sagebrush. He was 21 years old, an artist by heart, carrying a sketchbook filled with drawings of wildflowers and Native American beadwork rather than a thirst for war. But the year was 1865. The Civil War was ending in the East, but in the West, a new, darker fire was being stoked. The Gathering Storm. The story moves through the meticulously documented buildup of the bloody year on the plains. While the North and South were healing their wounds, the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were uniting under a leader the history books often whisper about,
Red Cloud. The narrative dives deep into the information war. Collins wasn't just a soldier. He was one of the few who learned the languages of the tribes. He realized that the savages the newspapers described were actually a sophisticated diplomatic machine. The tension builds as the U.S. government ignores the warnings of the men on the ground, obsessed with the expansion of the telegraph line, the talking wire that would connect New York to San Francisco. The Siege of Platte Bridge. The centerpiece of this epic is the Battle of Platte Bridge Station. Imagine a tiny fort manned by fewer than 100 men, surrounded by nearly 3,000 warriors. The story details the psychological grit of the soldiers, many of whom were galvanized Yankees, Confederate prisoners who agreed to fight Indians to get out of jail. You see the grit of the frontier, the taste of hardtack, the smell of black powder, and the haunting sound of the elk bone whistles echoing from the hills. When a wagon train goes missing, Collins is ordered to lead a rescue mission. It was a suicide mission. He knew it. His horse, a legendary gray charger, knew it. The narrative slows down to capture the heart-pounding moments of the charge, the Custer's last stand, before Custer was even a household name. The cultural tapestry. To make this resonate with a U.S. audience, the story weaves in the technological revolution. The introduction of the Henry repeating rifle changed the chemistry of the continent. The story explores the internal politics of the Cheyenne dog soldiers, providing a rich, respectful, and researched perspective on their tactical genius and the loss of their way of life. The legacy. The story ends not with a happily ever after, but with the founding of a city. The fort where Casper Collins fell would eventually become the city of Casper, Wyoming. It serves as a haunting reminder that every street in modern America is built over a layer of incredible, often heartbreaking, history.